microphone here while I keep it going so that we got the recording right. Okay, all right, we're set. I thought today that I would talk a bit about my forthcoming monograph, which is called Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. It's had many different titles over the past year while it's been in production, but this is where we finally netted out. But I'm also going to reference a few other pieces besides the monograph, because I think that there are some really interesting things that I've been thinking about that are in different places, and they're not all in the book. And so if you'll indulge me, it's also interesting to talk about this work in the context of being in the Bay Area, because much of this you all are living and are much more intimately familiar with than other people in other parts of the country. I lived in Oakland for 13 years at Lake Merritt. Oakland is my town. I go everywhere in the world, and I tell people Oakland is the #1 city in the world. I mean, it really is like one of the best places. And so I've always had my eye on what's happening in the Bay Area, because this is a place where many of my friends and my family still reside. So let's jump into a few things. You're not going to be able to see any slides, apparently. I've just discovered that, so I might have to tell you some of the things. I don't know if it's too hot for you to close the shades or not, if you want to make an attempt at it, but it might give you a chance to see a little bit better. I'll just say kind of broadly that my research agenda has really been about kind of making better sense of racist and sexist algorithmic bias, and trying to think about kind of looking at the end results of some of the major platforms that we're engaging with, and the results that they produce, and then thinking about what those mean in kind of a broader social context. I've also started some new work that's around what I call kind of a critical surveillance literacy, and that work is coming, and you'll be able to kind of, I'll be able to share that soon, but that's something that is definitely design flaw in that it really privileges an imaginary of whiteness and unbridled exploration and the Google Glass as events through its marketing strategy posits its wares as explorers, which we argue is kind of a familiar colonial narrative. Now, this disposition maps onto the current processes of radical gentrification and displacement in many San Francisco neighborhoods and signals that power, whiteness, and class elitism are core values in the Google Glass design imaginary. Glass's recognizable aesthetic and outward-facing camera has elicited intense emotional response, particularly when this kind of exploration has taken place in areas of San Francisco occupied by residents who are finding themselves priced out or evicted from their homes to make way for the techno-elite. Google Glass arrived at a time when Google, headquartered in Mountain View, had already incited people feeling the economic and emotional ramifications of the challenging landscape of the San Francisco Bay Area, as the latest tech boom has pushed people out of affordable housing via evictions. I lived in Oakland through the first tech boom and bust, so I personally was a victim of one of those evictions many years ago. Landlords across California, but particularly in San Francisco, have taken great advantage of the Ellis Act during the most recent techno boom in housing, allowing them to clear out all tenants of their multiple unit dwellings, often which are rent controlled, by claiming that the landlord is going out of business. This strategy is typically used to convert apartment buildings into high-priced condominiums. In other cases, landlords cleared out buildings multiple times under the guise of going out of business. We're going to have a going out of business once a year while we perpetually increase rents. These practices have made new and existing housing unaffordable for those residents not employed in high-paying sectors such as the tech industries or finance. Indeed, Newsweek reported that, quote, in 2005, after new technology companies like Google began attracting thousands of high-paid employees to the Bay, the number of Ellis evictions tripled. In 2013, Ellis evictions grew 175% from the year before. Google in particular has received special ire not only because of the perceptions of its presence being responsible for Ellis evictions, but also because of its ubiquitous fleet of luxury buses and their impact on life in the Bay Area. These coaches move San Franciscans who labor at its Mountain View corporate headquarters to and fro every day in private, Wi-Fi-enabled, air-conditioned comfort. According to the master's thesis of city planner Alexandra Goldman, rents at apartments near Google bus stops rose 20% during a period where the average rent increase was 5%. Included in her evidence were Craigslist ads denoting the presence of the Google bus stops as a perk for apartments located nearby. Apple, eBay, Twitter, Electronic Arts, Facebook, and Yahoo, among others, also run private bus lines, which have been protested by local residents. Indeed, Google and many high-tech companies in Silicon Valley have directly contributed to gentrification in previously multiracial neighborhoods in San Francisco. A challenge of gentrification, we know, is that it brings new wine bars, new vape shops, restaurants, and boutiques to areas that might previously not have had such high-end amenities. But gentrification has always been a narrative of improvement that draws upon a mystique of transforming previously uninhabitable places into spaces that can be occupied. Like colonial projects of the past that seek an expansion into new territories and locales, despite there already being inhabitants of those spaces, gentrification is hailed as offering an improvement or reinvestment into neighborhoods that, when occupied by low-income people of color, were seen not as valuable or necessarily productive. As San Francisco is overrun with tech workers, the majority of whom are white and Asian men with lucrative salaries and stock options, the city is experiencing hyper-gentrification, a term coined by policy analysts who watch the millionaires produced at local tech giant Twitter buy up all the middle-income housing, displacing urban residents. This exact same phenomenon is happening right now in LA, and it's a terrible time to be an assistant professor in LA because a career that we thought might make us middle class has in fact just kept us working class and working poor, because all of the affordable housing in LA is also disappearing with the invention of Silicon Beach. I guess on the upside, you might say that the private coaches do offer reduced greenhouse gas emissions versus all 4,500 riders taking private vehicles, but they've also monopolized local public transit bus stops in the Muni system, initially without remuneration, which Goldman found in her study. And so this has been kind of part of the notorious soft benefits at Google that appear egregious to those who do not work in similar tech industry settings. In short, the Google bus and the Google employees that ferries back and forth to Silicon Valley have become highly visible symbols of class division in San Francisco. And in response, locals have gone so far as to block buses from moving or stopping for pickups and even smashing bus windows. So you can't see this photo very well, but these are residents in San Francisco who have made their own sign that says warning illegal use of public infrastructure. And they're trying to block these buses. Utopian discourses of freedom through technology are not new. Critical geography scholars, I know, big ups to the geography students who are here because, yeah, it's like a whole bunch. I mean, who knew? I love it. The critical geography scholars have written extensively about hierarchies of power are reproduced and enacted through digital technologies, and they also point to the ways in which the informationalization and digitization of everyday life heightens control and surveillance. And it also establishes digital enclosures with power-laden boundaries across race, gender, and class. Technological projects are never neutral, and Google Glass is not a tool of freedom, despite its marketing discourse. Indeed, the most controversial aspect of Google Glass has been this outward-facing camera, allowing users to record things within their field of vision, which the camera then follows. Concerns have ranged from the potential theft of ATM passcodes by passerbys wearing Google Glass to the illegal infringements of glasswares recording copyrighted material in movie theaters, or the potential for cheating in Las Vegas casinos, which have banned glasswares, which I have to say is actually a brilliant idea. I mean, who would have thought glass in Vegas? I mean, that was a short window somebody had to really work it. Video resulting from all these potential uses of technology could easily be uploaded real-time or streamed to the internet to be circulated, stored, and owned by glass wearers, all without the consent of anyone within the Google Glass gaze. Consistently, critics and news reports have largely leveled critiques at the product as an important site of the fight to resist hyper-surveillance and to acknowledge kind of all of its attendant privacy concerns. These tensions and negative emotions reflect the growing distrust between the discourses of Google as a company for everyday people, providing seemingly free services that improve the quality of our lives while asking for nothing in return. Jay McGregor, writing for Forbes, said, quote, Google has suffered an image problem since it was accused of providing a backdoor to the National Security Administration in the Snowden documents. And indeed, these real-life contradictions, like selling the public out to the NSA or gentrifying low-income neighborhoods of color, are where the imaginary of Google's utopian benevolence are made most apparent. Likewise, Google Glass occupies a similarly visible and elitist cultural space, made available only through a limited beta program afforded to the wealthy and connected. While other Google products functions of data mining and usage tracking are undertaken on an individual basis, so my relationship to Gmail or my relationship to Calendar or Maps, it's me to the company. Google Glass instead is the visible manifestation of Google's tracking turned outward onto others, just as Google buses are the outward demonstration of neighborhood occupation and urban colonization. Google has now made us participants in the data collection process of others. In a rapidly gentrifying and increasingly economically stratified San Francisco, people have reacted with anger and insecurity when finding themselves the unwilling targets of Google Glass's gaze. In this context, the Glass users have been received in San Francisco and cities like it not only as glass holes, but also as class holes. And really now the product has gone back had gone for a couple of years back into beta to kind of reinvent itself. So here's stopthecyborgs.org. You can go and download posters, and people in Seattle and other kind of cities, tech corridors, were downloading these signs and putting them up in their windows, banning Google Glass wearers, particularly in restaurants and places where people kind of wanted to relax and be themselves. All right. So we have platforms as well, these kind of companies that are engaged in, and, you know, people ask me so much of the time, like, why do you just, you know, talk about Google, and what about Yahoo and Microsoft? And, you know, for me, it's really important to study the monopoly leader, because the monopoly leader is really kind of setting the tone for what other companies are interested in trying to, quite frankly, copy. And so I write about and critique Google as an information monopoly, and this is kind of some of the things. So I'm going to share with you a few highlights from the book that I think will illustrate what the book is about, and maybe how it might be able to support some of your research too. You might be familiar with this. In 2013, the United Nations launched a campaign here directed by Meemak Ogilvy and Mather Dubai, using what they called genuine Google searches. They did this to bring critical attention to the sexist and discriminatory ways in which women are regarded and denied human rights. Over the mouths of various women of color were the auto-suggestions that reflected the most popular searches that take place in Google search. So they typed in a couple of words, and then they looked to see what Google kind of auto-suggested for them. So when they typed in women cannot, they got drive, be bishops, be trusted, speak in church, women shouldn't have rights, vote, work, box. Women should stay at home, be slaves, be in the kitchen, not speak in church. Women need to be put in their place, know their place, be controlled, be disciplined. Christopher Hunt, the art director of the campaign, said, quote, "When we came across these searches, we were shocked by how negative they were, and we decided we had to do something with them," end quote. Now, what the campaign determined to show was how shocking the ads were, and they were really trying to make a case about gender equality, and that search results reflect kind of the sentiments of the public. And in fairness, I mean, this is a very kind of like a dominant narrative of the way that people think about how search engines work. I thought it was an interesting campaign because it was so reflective of kind of public sentiment about, I don't know, the base nature of human beings as reflected in search engines. But to me, this was a perfect example of a campaign that we could unpack and complicate a little bit more to think about how we get certain types of results in search engines. And I've really been kind of I don't know, maybe almost singularly obsessed with thinking about search and search results, partly because I come out of library and information science as a discipline. And when I, in my first career, I was in advertising and marketing, and I was just leaving advertising at a time when increasing amounts of our media buying dollars were going to digital media and to kind of gamifying search engines. I mean, that was what was happening in the advertising space when I left advertising in about 2007 or so. So I was stunned to go to information school and see that everyone was talking about Google like it was in the new kind of public library. And I was like, wait, what? What are we talking about? There's no way anybody can be thinking this is happening, because people in advertising knew it was an advertising platform and really related to it in such a way. Yet people who were academics who were in information school were trying to get Google grants and joining in these competitions and trying to think about how to make Google a better public information portal. And for me, this was curious, and I was thinking about kind of investigating that more deeply. Partially because I think that going back, kind of hearkening back to Herb Schiller, that we need to be thoughtful and concerned about information monopolies and what it means when kind of one platform controls what the public thinks of as the place to get their information needs met. And so this has, of course, huge implications for people like librarians and other kinds of information workers, academics, teachers, who previously were thought of as the kind of referent for vetting and making sense of information or knowledge, or at least participants in that process. And what I found as I was in information school is that many people were, in fact, instead thinking about, just thinking about scholarly information, and I was thinking about kind of information on the open web and what was happening there and where the fields might be able to move. There have been a series since I started writing about Google and kind of commercial information bias. There have been now just so many, dozens and dozens of technology kind of fails that we could point to. Here's one from about a year and a half or so ago. Dylann Roof, who some of you may know as a well-known kind of social media Twitter personality. He actually became super well-known once Beyonce followed him. So if anyone here knows Beyonce and you could get her to follow me, I feel like it could really amplify the work, So that's why we know Dylann. And Dylann tweeted out, if you Google map the N-word house, this is what you'll find: America. And what was happening, many of you might know the story, is that when you were doing a query on the N-word house or the N-word king, it would take you to the White House. Google Maps would kind of hone in on the White House. And so the Post quoted the U.S. News and World Report. U.S. News was kind of like the first to be able to get the story, and they quoted out, some inappropriate results are surfacing in Google Maps that should not be, and we apologize for any offense this may have caused, which my husband knows that if he tells me, like, I apologize if you're offended, that I actually don't feel offended. I mean, I don't feel apologized to. I just feel more offended. So, it's like a weird non-apology apology happening here. I'm sorry if you're offended about the N-word house going to the White House. A Google spokesperson says in an email late Tuesday, our teams are working to fix this issue quickly, which is really the most important kind of operative part of the statement. And this is a very typical kind of statement that might come out of a Silicon Valley tech company, which is that, as Lisa Nakamura talks about, that tech companies kind of have a discourse that there might be a glitch in the system momentarily at particular times, but otherwise the system works perfectly. And so there's nothing to see here. We're going to fix that glitch, or that this problem is actually not symptomatic of other kinds of structural issues or even deeper issues in the way the algorithms might be working. Here's another example that went viral last year. Google searches on professional hairstyles for work. So Twitter, people in Twitter were doing searches on professional hairstyles for work and Google Images, and what you would get back is exclusively black women with natural hair. So I wore my unprofessional hairstyle for you today, which is also the hairstyle I wear just about every day. Then when the search for professional hairstyles for work is done, exclusively white women with updos and ponytails. And I think it's, it's a cautionary tale, because what it says, it's really the updo and the ponytail that makes the difference for white women. So, again, you guys have no sense of humor today. I don't even know what's happening. It's scaring me a little bit. You don't have, just be with me. It's okay. Because this material is workshopped. I know it's funny, all right? So, it's all good. Here's another result now looking on a concept. So here we have a concept like beautiful. And I think this is interesting because you have beautiful on a 13-inch screen, and I kind of call attention to that because, if our hardware, let's say our screen was the size of the Empire State Building, we would have access to a lot more. But our hardware is not going up, it's actually going in the other direction, limiting even more so what's possible conceptually for us to see. And so here we have, now I didn't, in fairness, when we collected this search, I thought we would get nature, like the beach, some forest, because nature seems like a universally beautiful concept. I didn't expect it beautiful to be synonymous with hegemonic beauty standard, which is probably what I would have typed in to get these results, right? So, there's no white women added to this. There's no kind of beauty standard. There's just the concept beautiful. And I'm going to come back to this idea about concepts in search engines and what that means and what the problematics, again, and these were just baby stepping into this. This is a talk that I have to say is best followed by cocktails, because it just goes down, 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 down. All right, there's no up. All right, so I'm pre-warning you. We're just sliding down the slope. So I first started collecting searches on a variety of kind of intersectional identities. I was looking at kind of the more common ways in which race and ethnicity is characterized, mostly by the census categories, because those are kind of really formative ways in which people come to understand kind of racial and ethnic classification. And of course, I'm approaching this thinking about this in kind of in the information science classification frameworks. So here's Google's misrepresentations of Asian and Latina girls. And we have, search for Asian girls. This is from 2014. Asian girls, porn, and sex pictures and movies is our first hit, followed by Asian girls, Asian porn, online dating, Asian dating, why Asian girls go for white guys, Asian girls, RedTube, free porn. All the ads are also kind of leading you to dating online, kind of hypersexualized content. And of course, this is really important because, the notion of the way that search engines work is that we have organic search engines on one side and advertising on the other side, and that there's somehow a separation. Except if you know how AdWords work, which is kind of the auctioning off of keywords to associate them with your product. If you're trying to advertise, the whole logic is to associate ads with certain keywords. So it's unclear how that could then be a separate kind of distinction. In fact, it's like really dependent upon the types of keywords that are put into the search in order to maximize. And we know that the highest bidder pretty much is how the ads show up, who's willing to pay for those ads, pay more in the kind of online real-time auctioning that's going on around us. Latina girls, as you can see, kind of similarly depressing representations. I started collecting search results in 2009 was about the first time that I looked. I was particularly interested. I was talking to my colleague Andre Brock at the University of Michigan. Some of you might know him. He writes about Black Twitter and he's amazing. And we're just trash talking about everything and how messed up everything is and how depressing our research agendas are and those kinds of things. He just kind of threw off something like, yeah, you should see what happens when you search for black girls. And I was like, don't tell me. And he's like, you already know. And I was like, I do know. And then I went and I spent some time and I started asking other people to collect, and I started, going to different places and was working with other grad students. And then we formulated a study to really look at a number of different kinds of queries on girls, women, boys, girls, boys, men, across kind of, again, these census categories. And so I have literally hundreds and hundreds of searches that I've done over the years. But the kind of those early black girls queries where you have, the majority of the content on the first page really reflecting kind of this hyper-pornification, hyper-sexualization of black girls has really been consistent, and you see that with the Asian girls and Latina girls. And so I started writing the book really out of kind of by 2012. What you have here in 2009, hotblackpussy.com was the first, I'm going to say pussy a bunch of times right now, and then we're going to get past it, but I just want to, some people are going to love that, and some people aren't. So Sugary Black Pussy by 2011 was the dominant, it was the first hit, kind of consistently, followed by Black Girls, the band. Has anyone heard of the Black Girls? It's a band from the UK of white guys who call themselves the Black Girls, who are excellent at search engine optimization and terrible at music distribution. So they made it to number 2, followed by Porn Site, Black Girls, Big Booty Black Girls 100% free Black Girls chat. The Black Girls, the band, their Facebook page, also winning. Ebony Girls, Ebony Sex, Black Girls, Ebony Sex Threesome, Black Girl, Long Hair, and that's a blog. Now this held pretty consistent from 2000 to 2012, these types of sites. And part of this is because the porn industry has a lot of money. And one of the things, if you study pornography online, is that we have a lot we owe the porn industry around the internet. I mean, when the Broadway show Avenue Q is like the internet was made for porn. I mean, it actually was. It was made because of porn, we might say. Video compression, credit card processing, bandwidth concerns, all these things have really been heavily invested in by the porn industry to kind of maximize their reach. And so one of the strategies that they use is to kind of optimize the long tails. So they will purchase and kind of try to bid on a variety of really interesting combinations of words. And so this is one of the ways that they're kind of able to monopolize certain identities. Now, of course, all these porn sites are women. So at a very basic kind of, Women's Studies 101, we have women coded as girls. I wanted to write about this for Bitch Magazine. Bitch Magazine, I used to read it when I lived here in the Bay Area. It's like a feminist magazine that critiques popular culture. They had an issue out on cyberculture, and it was too late to tell them that cyberculture was not what we were saying anymore, but it was fine. And I wanted to write about this. I really wanted to write first for Essence Magazine, because I thought this was a great critical kind of media literacy thing that black women need to know about. And Essence Magazine's a magazine that caters to black women and women of color. But you have to be a famous writer to get to write for Essence Magazine. So I begged bitch because I was not anyone, and still am not. So I was very grateful. It took many rounds with bitch to get them to let me write this story. Finally, the thing that pushed them over was I said, I think you should do a query on women's magazines and let me know if Bitch Magazine shows up in the first 5 pages of search results. And of course, keep in mind that most people only go to the first page and don't go beyond the first page of search results. And about 5 minutes later, I don't know, I had a visualization of what was happening in the office. People were like, get over here and look at this. And then they wrote back and said you could write the story. And so that was how I got that story kind of placed there. And it has ended up being like a really interesting primer on how to think about what search engines, commercial search information spaces are doing. One of the things that I stress in that piece is that in that very example, that the entire concept of feminism had been divorced from the word women. And so if you were looking for feminism in women's magazines, you would not find feminist magazines, in fact, in that query. You would get the typical kind of Vogue magazine, Elle, Good Housekeeping, which I didn't even know was still around, but it was, those kinds of magazines. And so what does it mean, again, that conceptually something like feminism gets divorced from a keyword like women? And then I wrote a scholarly piece about that. Now, these notions of hypersexualized images of women, particularly of black women, are not new. And this is one of the things that I think is really important that we think about. I'm talking to an overeducated crowd about this. I mean, many of you really understand the nuances of this, but this, these kind of old media representations that have been around really, since like the 19th century, kind of collections that have happened in the United States. There's a wonderful museum online called the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. I use it all the time in my teaching, and it's a way to kind of help students make sense of what these images mean. When I was looking at it, and to tell you kind of what a serious information classification problem this is, it's not just Google. Even in the library and information spaces, this is problematic. When I was trying to clear images of these kind of I was looking for these kind of 20th century postcards, the Jim Crow era postcards. Here you have kind of a hypersexualized child in the kind of pickaninny stereotype, which was really devised to devalue the lives of black children. And often you would see this kind of caricature being eaten by alligators or crocodiles, and all kinds of ashtrays and paraphernalia of this type. This postcard says, "Honey, I'm waiting for you," which is a really kind of popular trope that was used during the Jim Crow era. And when I looked for these kinds of images, even in ArtStore, which is our kind of largest online art image database in the library, I was searching, racist memorabilia, racist images, stereotypes, black stereotypes, just like I just could not get to these images. And finally, I found them, and guess how they were classified? Black history. Now, some of us in our field might have characterized this or classified. A radical librarian probably would have classified it as white history. So these are the kinds of interpretations that are happening at the level of metadata also when we start thinking about the organization of information, and I think this is really important. These same kind of similar processes bleed over in these kind of database environments to commercial search engines. So the frameworks for them are really important. Now, this is in fact what we're more likely to come across when we're engaging. I just happened to take this screenshot on Valentine's Day, so I don't know what I was doing on Valentine's Day thinking about this. The interface of the search engine is really, I think, a mechanism for accessing the internet, and it's really not immune nor impartial to the concerns of embedded value systems. And this is ultimately what we're talking about. What are the types of values that get embedded into our technologies? In fact, interfaces like this deny the possibility of a visible classification, and they acculturate the public to the notion that knowledge is both easily accessible and instantly available, even knowledge that is still highly contested. So one of the challenges with these kinds of projects is that here we are in a university, we have many departments and disciplines who look at the same complex phenomena from multiple perspectives. And we sometimes do battle over kind of what are the meanings that could and should be made through various lenses. This is a way of acculturating us to knowledge to think that all questions can be answered in 0.03 seconds. And this is one of the things that if you teach undergraduates or you work with undergraduates, this is a very difficult thing to dislodge, is this idea that we can instantly know. I think the classification of information in search engines is really more than just the specific mathematical algorithms and the deep machine learning that's developed by computer scientists and software engineers who are working hard to index upwards of 1 trillion pages of information and move it from the universal data pile to the first page of results on a computer screen. Many of us remember the old internet before the pre-Google, when we had experts who created directories, and even that was deeply political. Who got to decide? I mean, we see that kind of carry over into other spaces like Wikipedia now. This idea of kind of who controls the narratives, the knowledge that's accessible, that is findable, who even has access to insert their knowledge into the knowledge paradigms, that's highly contested. Nobody knows that more than kind of a black woman academic. And yet we have these kinds of ways that make those processes opaque and really hard to be legible. Media and communications scholar Alex Galloway destabilizes the idea that digital technologies are transparent, benign windows or doors providing a view or a path to somewhere and in itself insignificant. The digital interface is a material reality. It's structuring a discourse. It's embedded with historical relations, working often under the auspices of ludic capitalism, where a kind of playful engagement of labor is masked in vital digital media platforms like Google. And we know we're seeing now the unveiling. I kind of started this section with, platforms unraveling. The idea that the kinds of internet that we're experiencing in the United States is a highly open, free, democratic space, free from kind of any kind of manipulation other than representing the kind of zeitgeist of our culture, of our era. Now we see there are, in fact, legions of people like commercial content moderators who are making all kinds of decisions about what can come up into our platforms or not. Sarah Roberts, my colleague, who I write quite a bit with, has done kind of the first full academic study of this, and her work is probably something that you're increasingly coming across. And so search is really a whole political process, and these kinds of interfaces really make it difficult for us to make sense of that. Now, we lost our picture here, but really it's kind of a screenshot of a study that was heavily critiqued in Forbes. In the study, this study was conducted by Epstein and Robertson. Some of you might be familiar with this study in 2013. Their study was called Democracy is at Risk because manipulating search rankings could shift voters' preferences substantially without their awareness. And it's really difficult to give this talk because when I was talking about the way that black women and women of color and girls of color were maligned in search engines and like the incredible power that search engines were having in our society, no one really cared until it threw a presidential election. And now everyone is kind of realizing, that these things can happen. And Epstein and Robertson, I think really their study just foreshadowed exactly what we experienced in the last presidential election. Now they found in their controlled study that the tenor of stories about a candidate, whether they were favorable or favorable, dramatically affected the way that candidates voted. So they did a controlled study. They showed people thought they were doing searches, and positive stories about a candidate came up, and people said they were going to vote for that person. And they did queries that they thought, again, were just neutral and objective, and negative stories about a candidate came up, and they said they were not going to vote for that person. They were going to vote against them. Now, from their study, they concluded, quote, that the outcomes of real elections, especially tight races, can conceivably be determined by the strategic manipulation of search engine rankings, and that the manipulation can be accomplished without people being aware of it. We speculate that unregulated search engines could pose a serious threat to the democratic system of government. And I think this is also consistent, their study. I'm also arguing that the undermining of communities who have very little ability in terms of capital and also numbers in the population to either game the system and change the types of results that are represented about them, or to amass enough capital, like the porn industry, let's say, that they can compete on those terms, makes it incredibly problematic for people to rely upon these platforms as a meaningful source of information to bolster democracy. One other scholar that you might be familiar with, Matthew Hinman, he wrote an important book called The Myth of Digital Democracy, and in it he also argued that political action committees had their use of capital really could control the information landscape about electoral politics. We see when these critiques come up, that Google has, again, some interesting conceptions of its work and what it's doing. So, just recently in the last year, white nationalists had taken over and kind of optimized around Bayesian anthropology, which is kind of a branch of anthropology. And we see consistently over and over where kind of white nationalists, white supremacists will take over certain terms like Jew or Jews and point those words toward Holocaust denial websites or to content that wholly refutes the plausibility of the Holocaust. And the Inquisitor interviewed, Gizmodo originally interviewed Sergey Brin, which was kind of picked up in the Inquisitor. And when Sergey Brin was asked about adjusting the algorithm to prevent such search results from reaching the top levels of search, he says that would be bad technology practice. He says an important part of our values as a company is that we don't edit the search results. What our algorithms produce, whether we like it or not, are the search results. I almost can't read this without laughing. I think people want to know we have unbiased search results. Okay, so it's like this consistent idea of like there's a glitch, we're not responsible for the algorithm or for the results that it produces. And of course, one of my challenges to this is if Google is not responsible for its own algorithm, then who in the world is? Because no one else can see it, right? So we have to kind of ask, again, these questions. Now, this is a very typical kind of disclaimer when years ago, and people like Jesse Daniels have been writing about kind of white supremacy and who has more voice and more power and more agency online. She wrote a great book called Cyber Racism. Siva Vaidhyanathan wrote a great book called The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry years ago. These kinds of things come up in their work too, where Google says, for example, if you've recently used Google to search for the word Jew, you may have seen results that were disturbing. We assure you that the views expressed by the sites and your results are not in any way endorsed by Google. We'd like to explain why you're seeing these results as you conduct this search. A science ranking in Google search relies heavily on computer algorithms using thousands of factors to calculate a page's relevance to a given query. Sometimes subtleties of language cause anomalies to appear that cannot be predicted. And then in their disclaimers, they'll often go on to say, you shouldn't have searched on the word Jew or Jews, you should use Jewish people, and that will take you somewhere different. But I think this is also an interesting discourse of kind of putting the onus back on us, rather than taking responsibility for the kinds of decision trees that are being created in the algorithm lab. I will say that, in fairness, web indexing is an incredibly difficult project. And I've been working with information professionals trying to think about things like indexing the open web along other kinds of values other than kind of the advertising imperative. And these are very, very complicated information science projects, particularly if you're trying to take in these kind of nuanced dimensions of power. Racialized and gendered power that can influence the decisions. Now, let me just say the last kind of last case that I kind of want to point to. And that is what happens when we start searching for meaning, or when the public starts to engage for much more meaningful things than kind of like a literal representation of Black girls or Asian girls or Latina girls, or even like who's the intended audience for those things. Concepts like beautiful, of course, we know are problematic, and these are, again, emblematic of other forms of media. I think it's interesting, though, to think about kind of what happens when people are searching for meaning. So I'm going to kind of cut to this one for the sake of time. So here we have the case of Dylann Roof. Dylann Roof, many of you may know, was a 21-year-old white supremacist who opened fire on June 17th in 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina, on unsuspecting worshipers at the Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in one of the more heinous racial and religious hate crimes of recent memory. Now, the location of the murders, for those of you who don't know, is really not chosen in vain by Roof. The Emanuel AME Church has really stood as one of the oldest symbols of African American freedom in the United States. It was organized by free and enslaved Black and African people in 1791, where its membership grew into the thousands, only to be burned down in 1822, when white South Carolinians heard a rumor that church member Denmark Vesey was organizing a revolt to free enslaved Blacks from their masters. For over 200 years, the Emmanuel AME Church has been a site and a symbol of struggle for freedom from white supremacy, and a place where organizing for civil rights and full participation of African Americans has been foregrounded by its members and by its supporters. Right after Dylann Roof opened fire, many people were online trying to figure out, who was this person, what could we do. I was in the middle of writing the book, and so I started writing another chapter about this particular event. Within about 24 hours, someone on Twitter found Dylann Roof's manifesto at thelastRhodesian.com. It was later authenticated by the FBI, and many people started pouring through the Southern Poverty Law Center. Others were kind of looking through. And this was the part of Roof's manifesto that was particularly disturbing and upsetting, as all of it was really, but this is just really jumped out. He says, in his own words, the event that truly awakened me was the Trayvon Martin case. I kept hearing and seeing his name, and eventually I decided to look him up. I read the Wikipedia article, and right away I was unable to understand what the big deal was. It was obvious that Zimmerman was in the right, but more importantly, this prompted me to type in the words black on white crime into Google, and I've never been the same since that day. The first website I came to was the Council of Conservative Citizens. There were pages upon pages of these brutal black on white murders. I was in disbelief. At this moment, I realized that something was very wrong. How could the news be blowing up the Trayvon Martin case while hundreds of these black on white murders got ignored? From this point, I researched deeper and found out what was happening in Europe. I saw that the same things were happening in England and France and in all the other Western European countries. Again, I found myself in disbelief. As an American, we're taught to accept living in the melting pot, and black and other minorities have just as much right to be here as we do, since we're all immigrants. But Europe is the homeland of white people, and in many ways the situation is even worse there. From here I found out about the Jewish problem and other issues facing our race, and I can say today that I am completely racially aware. Okay, so this is Dylann Roof's own words. Now, according to the manifesto, Dylann Roof's allegedly typing black on white crime to make sense of the news reporting on Trayvon Martin. You couldn't see, the image didn't show previously, but I wrote a paper for the Black Scholar about immediately following kind of the acquittal of George Zimmerman, to see what the auto-suggestions were about Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. And in that paper, you can really see the ways in which Trayvon Martin in autosuggest is, deeply framed as a thug, a criminal, a problem, a drug user, and George Zimmerman autosuggestions are really speaking to him as like a hero, and other types of kind of similar words. So I found this compelling because when we tried to recreate the searches, and so had people in different, when we do these searches, we try to use machines that haven't been logged into social media, that have like the most limited digital traces that we can get outside of that the computer is registered to someone and it is getting on on the web. And so there is an IP address and there's kind of a geolocality to it. And we found that the Council of Conservative Citizens is what comes up when you do a search on black on white crime. Now, what you don't get when you do that search is you don't get things like the Federal Bureau of Investigation crime statistics. So you don't get FBI crime statistics in the United States. And if you did get that, any kind of crime word trigger, you might see that in FBI statistics, most violence against white Americans is committed by other white Americans, as is most violence among African Americans committed by other African Americans, because violent crime is largely a matter of perpetration by proximity to those who are demographically similar to the victim. So you can put white on white crime into your vernacular now, or you could take black on black crime out, right? So these are the kinds of things that we might think about, like, again, these discourses. the homicides across racial lines really don't happen the way white supremacist organizations report them out. And what's also problematic about the query is that you don't get pointed to any kind of academic or scholarly work about race in the United States. You don't get experts on race and racialization. You don't get pointed to university resources or other kinds of books and articles that would really dispel the stereotype that's purported by white supremacist organizations around this kind of red herring phrase that they use to radicalize mostly young white people in the United States right now. So I think it's really important that we're thinking about the implications of people who are attempting to vet information in the news media, with Dylann Roof saying he's trying to make sense of the Trayvon Martin case, and being led to this kind of fascist, conservative, anti-black, anti-Jewish, white supremacist kind of content. You know, the power of search engines to lead people to kind of a breadth and depth of information, I don't think can be more powerfully illustrated than in looking at this case. And these are some of the reasons. I mean, I'm just trying to give you in a very short period of time some of the examples of why we might want to care more deeply. Here you have The Guardian now. You know, again, as the mainstream media is starting to pick up some of these stories. Here you have two stories about Google not just being a platform, and of course Facebook is coming under the similar fire. The desire to just be a platform really comes out of this incredible responsibility that platforms have when they start having to be responsible or take responsibility for the kind of content that circulates in them. So there's always been a very strong commitment on the part of tech CEOs to be very clear that they're just a platform, not responsible for the content that flows through it. But in the case of search, and also in the case of Facebook, the algorithms are in effect pointing to particular types of content. So there can be no disavowal, I think, at this point, despite kind of what the narratives are that we hear. We see Germany and also France, recent court cases against Facebook and Google, that they're going to have to kind of act upon this. In France and Germany in particular, anti-Semitic content cannot be trafficked in, and it has to be suppressed. So think back to Sergey Brin's kind of message for the US audience, which is we don't manipulate search engine because that would be bad technology practice, except for in Germany and France where the law requires us to do it, and then we're totally doing it. So this is kind of, again, an interesting paradox. And I think we might be asking ourselves as well more questions about free speech, First Amendment, the limits of it, how far it can go, particularly at a time when we're living in, I think, what we could say is another crisis of racist violence that's happening, and racial wealth disparity that's happening kind of since Reconstruction. One of the things that I think is probably like the headline, the takeaway, is we have more technology than ever, and we have more social inequality and social injustice to go with it. So complicating these ideas that there's some type of liberatory possibility, you know, we don't have the app that solved global poverty, and I don't think it's going to come through that mechanism, right? We have these words like innovation and engineering around possibilities, but we have an ever-widening material gap that's happening in our society and in the world. And I think that these are things that we have to ask. Certainly, data and technology are implicated in those disparities. In the intersectional internet, you know, we try to think about some of these kinds of things, and I'll just kind of wrap here. You know, I've been thinking a lot about, of course, the representational concerns, but my work has really moved lately to thinking about more of the materiality about our technologies. So what about the minerals that have to be sourced in order to make electronics? What about the water that is used by Intel and other companies, millions of gallons a day? What's happening in terms terms of the degradation of environments when all of these devices get thrown in the trash and they're put on barges and they're sent to China, they're sent to West Africa, where we have new, huge toxic e-waste cities that are emerging around the world. And again, with Dana Boyd, I just heard her give a talk. We were kind of at a conference together last summer, and she talked about the petabytes of data that on a daily basis that are used just for Facebook notifications. So think about the storage, think about the energy use around the kinds of innovations, so to speak, and where does that get displaced and outsourced to? And of course, we know that in many cases, these flows of capital and labor exploitation are flowing through kind of old colonial models. And there are many scholars that I think are starting to draw really a finer point on that. So I would say that, what are the things we need to take away? We need to be rejecting these notions of neutrality and objectivity in our technologies as if. And of course, we're doing this work now here, I think, in your center, kind of to embrace these critical perspectives on information and technology, but we're not in the majority in the scholarly sense around this. So I think these are things we need to think about. More importantly, I think we've got to be thinking about the way in which these information platforms are impacting notions of democracy and giving more or less speech to different people, and of course what the larger implications of these overinvestments that I like to say are happening in the tech sector and who pays the cost for those. All right, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.